Some interesting things that are happening on the domestic front with regards to Ukraine. We covered previously how GOP lawmakers had said that they would see a tough time passing new aid to Ukraine, specifically military aid by Kevin McCarthy. He said that the American people can no longer have a blank check for Ukraine. He was quickly, however, rebuked by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who was like, no, we're going to do anything that we want for Ukraine. So there's a little bit of war going on. There's like three camps is how I would describe it. McCarthy is under pressure, not from people who are skeptical of the war, but of the fiscal hawks who are like, hey, we shouldn't be doing $50 billion. And actually current indications are that Democrats are going to try and pass another $60 billion in aid for Ukraine in order to preempt all of this. That would bring it to $110 billion, which is, as I have read, more than any foreign aid to any country ever, especially in a military conflict, on par right now with South Vietnam in the middle of the Vietnam War. Just to put it in context. Anyway,
but it's not a proxy war, guys.
Right. Anyway, so there's the fiscal people. Then there's like people kind of like us, probably the smallest contingent of like maybe 5 to 10 lawmakers at best in the House of Representatives who are like, hey, maybe we should do something else. We contingent this aid on diplomacy, etc. Then there's the third camp, which are like the McConnell folks who are like, no, we're not having no question, no debates. We're going to give Ukraine anything it possibly could want. Anyway, let's put this up there on the screen. So Ukraine is now telling the GOP that, quote, it can't just be about guns. I found this really fascinating, which is that Ukrainian leaders believe, despite notes from some on the far right, that the GOP won't skimp on giving Kyiv military aid. In fact, Ukraine expects even more robust weapons packages if Republicans are in charge. That is according to their own lobbyists here in Washington. The Ukrainians are, though, more concerned about Republicans paring back future economic aid to the country. And this is something I've actually tried to emphasize here a little bit, which is that, look, you know, the war is the war. But, you know, Ukraine as an economic polity basically does not exist without the United States. We pay all their bills, balancing their budget, effectively backstopping their currency, making sure that they can buy things on the global market. All of that is because of U.S. Treasury aid. And actually, the United States has given the vast majority of economic aid to Ukraine. So it's actually interesting because one of the critiques I had seen, and this I could see really landing with some GOP officials, was when Rand Paul and others were like, we're balancing Ukraine's budget before we balance our own. Now, I don't even necessarily believe in a balanced budget on the federal level, but what I'm telling people is that that attack line actually could quite well land with the GOP caucus. They've never had a trouble writing blank checks to military aid, right? But on this, the Ukrainians are probably correct to think, hey, you know, this could be a real problem for us because, I mean, if you think inflation is bad here in Ukraine, it's like nobody even really knows. 30, 40%. I mean, it's a classic wartime economy. Their budgets are a mess. Their own currency itself is effectively like completely backstopped by the Federal Reserve and the U.S. economic system. So the point being that if they lose some of that, it actually could cause major problems for them on their ability to buy weapons and other things out on the global market, even to, you know, denominate different ways their transactions for grain, etc. From what I've read, it could be a serious problem. Anyway, it's interesting to me that the Ukrainian government, they're relatively confident they're going to get their weapons, but they're like, no, we really need the economic aid to keep this thing going too.
Because they don't just have Zelensky arguing for the weapons, they have all the weapons manufacturers also lobby. I mean, that's where the real divide goes. Why are the Republicans so anxious and willing to send military aid but reluctant on economic aid? Well, they're getting campaign contributions from all of the, you know, military industrial complex. So they have a big political incentive to continue moving in that direction. And then if they withhold the economic aid, they get to play, you know, virtuousness on the fiscal front. And there is a real populist message that I think just doesn't just land with the Republican base, but land with a lot of Americans of like, oh, Jackson, Mississippi doesn't even have clean water, and yet we're, you know, shipping all of this aid, no strings attached, to the Ukrainians indefinitely, writing them a blank check. So I do think, as we've been saying, as we get into winter, as, you know, inflation continues to bite, as this thing goes on and on with no real end in sight, as some of the, you know, failures of the U.S. policy and the NATO policy up to this point become more and more manifest, I think there's going to be an increasing political audience for that type of messaging. And, you know, at the same time, there's increasing reports the Biden administration is kind of frustrated with Zelensky and sees him as kind of like ungrateful for the overwhelming support that we've been providing. There were some indications of that actually in the Politico article that we just had up. They said early in the conflict, Zelensky urged the U.S. to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, but Biden, of course, declined. More recently, he's called on Biden to formally declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. And they are sort of frustrated with although they understand that Zelensky is just trying to look out for his own national interests, and I think we all get that, there's a frustration with the amount of aid that we've sent and then the continued escalation of public demands from Zelensky. That apparently broke out into the open on a phone call back in June. According to a report, let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. Apparently, Biden lost his temper. He got grumpy old man with Zelensky in a June phone call when the Ukrainian leader asked for more aid. And the context here is they say Biden had barely finished telling Zelensky he just greenlighted another $1 billion in U.S. military assistance for Ukraine when Zelensky already started listing all the additional help that he needed and wasn't getting. Biden lost his temper. People familiar with the call said American people were being quite generous, and his administration, the U.S. military, were working hard to help Ukraine, he said, raising his voice, and Zelensky could show a little more gratitude. It's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. I mean, I think everyone almost certainly expects that the Senate may be a little bit of a dicier proposition, but Republicans are almost certain to be in control of the House. And the House is actually where you have more dissent in the Republican caucus in terms of the direction on Ukraine aid. So there's a possibility here that this could be some sort of negotiating leverage for Biden, where he can play a kind of good cop, bad cop of like, of course, I want to continue supporting you, but I got to deal with these Republicans in Congress and they have different views about this. It could, in a sense, strengthen his hand if he wants it to.
See, I just don't think so, because I think the Dems will just give him $60 billion beforehand. They'll just pre-appropriate it.
Yeah, but we see how fast they rip through that.
Well, they haven't even spent most of that. A lot of it, I think more than half of it has not even yet been dispersed. So they're effectively just going to write. Remember how and this has always been my problem with the aid, which is that I don't have any problem giving the Ukrainians military aid, but I think that a lot of it should be constrained by the People's Congress and by some goals for what exactly we want in Ukraine. So, for example, I don't think any aid should go to Ukraine if they're going to use it to maybe bomb a bridge in Crimea, or maybe launch an airstrike on Crimea with a U.S.-provided weapon.
Or bomb a Russian civilian on their own soil.
You want to do that and get into a war by yourself, you be my guest, but you're not going to do it with the stuff that we give you. And so that's always been my issue, which is that none of this is preconditioned. And unfortunately, the way that, and I read this, if people will remember the last time that supplemental aid passed, I read through those provisions where it just says to the President of the United States up until 2025 may disperse that as his will to the country of Ukraine. That's the issue, which is that, and again, remember, look, Biden could drop dead tomorrow. You want Kamala to have $68 billion to play with, to give whatever she wants to the Ukrainians? You should ask yourself that question.
Yeah.
Same with Trump, just so everybody knows. I mean, you know, Trump is exactly a yo-yo on Ukraine. He's constantly either we should nuke Russia or the other way. All of this aid, just so people will be aware, would be completely at the disposal of the commander-in-chief of the United States for whomever holds that office.
You know, it was interesting. I was looking at some of this polling last week, and in the early phases of the conflict, the critique coming from Republicans, including Trump, and really led in certain ways by Trump, was that the Biden administration wasn't doing enough. They weren't shipping enough weapons. They weren't doing the no-fly zone. They weren't being hawkish enough. Now, as you said, that's sort of yo-yoed to what I consider to be a better position of, you know, we can't do this forever. We need to have preconditions. I mean, in the best of their critiques, some of their critiques are a little bit off the mark, but in the best of their critiques, it's like, hold up, let's have a little bit of let's have some accountability about where this is all going. That could just as easily yo-yo right back to they're not doing enough and we need to ship more weapons. And in fact, that's where all of the center of gravity really pulls you in Washington, D.C. That's the easiest case to make. All of the cable news networks, but especially CNN and Fox News, are all primed to make that argument. It's frankly, at this point with the American people, given the way that the war, you know, has been, like the lack of education on the war and the potential consequences that has occurred with the U.S. media, it'd be easier to make that case to the American people, ultimately, given where their emotions are right now. So it's just as easy to see the Lindsey Grahams and the Mitch McConnells of the world winning out the argument and having the Republican base led by Republican leadership saying, no, 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 we need to do more. We need to give them the longer range missiles. We need to be all in, especially when it comes to weapons. So I don't put that off the table whatsoever.
You shouldn't put it off the table. We already had a redux of this. It's called 2014 and then 2018. So what happened? So brief history lesson. Barack Obama gets savaged by John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and many other people, Mike Pompeo, and others for not shipping Javelin missiles to Ukraine. And they're like, you need to give him Javelins. And Obama was like, no, I'm not going to do it. He does a major spread with Jeffrey Goldberg where he says, at the end of the day, I'm roughly quoting him here. He says, at the end of the day, Ukraine will always be a core interest for Russia. It's not a core interest for us. And if people want want us to go to war with Russia, they should say that, because I don't believe that we should. Very different rhetoric pre-Russiagate. Trump comes into office despite all of this, oh, I want a Russian reset, etc. He abandons that at a policy level, caves to Mike Pompeo, the Lindsey Grahams of the world, immediately starts shipping javelins over to Ukraine. And look, I mean, accelerated the civil war almost certainly to the point of where it is. I'm not saying that's the sole cause. I'm saying it was obviously some factor in what happened over there. So we have had that play out. It is not a guarantee that they don't do that. And in fact, it's very possible, as they said, that they could pass even more demanding things through Congress, telling Biden that he has to ship certain weapon systems to Ukraine if the aid does want to get signed by the commander-in-chief. So look, it's a jump ball on how exactly it all goes. And I don't want anyone to come away with the idea that, you know, if the Republicans take control, this is going to change the situation on the ground. I actually think it's probably the opposite, as you said. Overwhelming pressure. I've said a lot of controversial things in my life. I don't think people have ever been more angry with me than when I question the Ukraine consensus, just so everybody is aware.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, you saw what happened to the progressives when they tiptoed barely into that water.
The difference is I don't give a shit.
Right. That is the difference. And you have a little tiny bit of a backbone, unlike them, that are just total mushes, with the exception of Ro Khanna, who I do want to give credit to.
Correct.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.